Okay, this is the second half of chapter 4 on pregnancy, normal pregnancy. We ended our first half about talking about the macronutrients and how fat is stored. It's accumulated in the first half in an anabolic stage where we're actually storing fat. The progesterone, human chorionic hormones are causing this to be allowed. It inspires the insulin or triggers the insulin to put down more fat. And then the second half of the pregnancy is when we actually catabolism occurs, and that fat that's been stored the first half is broken down and used for the mother's energy so that the glucose can be available for the baby. So that's why you'll see very high levels of lipid, triglycerides, phospholipids, lipoproteins, cholesterol. Mostly triglycerides are elevated the second half of pregnancy. And another interesting point is the lipoprotein lipase also is more elevated because that is there to break down a lipoprotein so that they can be used for ketogenesis, for fatty acid use for the mother. So here it just shows that, I think we talked about this already, that the cholesterol from the first to the third trimester increases, as does the triglyceride level. The minerals are absorbed more readily, so the RDA for calcium for a pregnant woman who's over 19 is still 1,000 milligrams, which is the same for a normal woman. That's because calcium is increased in its absorption, so more is absorbed from your diet. There's more turnover, so there's more calcium released from the bones, more reforming of the bones. So the RDA hasn't changed. Unless you're a teenager, then it does go higher because you're still building bone. Sodium doesn't change either, and they don't suggest restricting it. But what does happen, as we mentioned, I think, is that sodium retention increases because aldosterone increases, which means we retain more sodium, which means you retain more water. So that's what's happening early in pregnancy and all throughout pregnancy, that you have a much higher fluid content. In addition to that, just to see the basal metabolic rate also increases. So you're oxidizing fat, you're oxidizing carbohydrate for energy, and you're synthesizing protein. All of that increases your BMR. You can see that it increases quite dramatically as a pregnancy, especially the last trimester, because now the baby is growing at the highest rate, so there's more oxidation, more basal metabolic activity at that point. Also notice that the fat, how high it jumps in the first, this is just week 5, huge increase in fat, levels off for a few weeks, and then a huge decrease in the fat stores, and that's what we're talking about. That's the breakdown of fatty acids for energy. Protein synthesis stays in a nice trajectory throughout the whole pregnancy as more tissue is growing and being developed. And the first tissue we mentioned that's developing is the placenta. That's a whole organ that isn't even present in a non-pregnant woman. This is one of the first things that forms, and it is an endocrine and exocrine organ. It produces hormones like progesterone and estrogen. Those are initially produced by the corpus luteum, and now as the placenta forms, by the second month, you'll have action from the placenta producing those hormones. And the enzymes are also produced to allow the breakdown of nutrients. The function of the placenta is to transfer nutrients across the membrane from the mother to the baby, and to take waste like oxygen and carbon dioxide and other wastes. And it is a double lining. So if I show you, if there's a picture to show this double lining between the fetal side and the maternal side. So there is no actual touching of the blood between the baby and the mother, but there's this fluid, or kind of like lymph, between the cells of the mother and the baby. So the double membrane between each of these veins and arteries allows the nutrients to pass into the fetal side. So that's how they gain the nutrients, the lipids, the fats, the minerals and vitamins. And then the wastes are transferred back to the mother and then released through her system. So it's quite an advanced system. If you want to watch how it's formed, you can click on either one of these videos to see how the placenta is actually formed. So this, of course, it depends on the size of the molecules and what's going to pass through. Progesterone also actually makes it easier for lipids to go and pass through the membrane, so the baby has plenty of fats. For the brain development, for the cell membrane development, for the nerve development, the fats are really, really important. And as we mentioned earlier, the folate is important the first month of the pregnancy, and that needs to pass into the baby before for DNA structure formation. The other thing is if you don't get enough energy or calories or nutrients as a mother, then you will end up with a baby that's either low birth weight or small for gestational age. So you will get your needs first, the babies last. That's why we end up with some low birth weight babies from mothers that have not eaten an adequate diet. Some of the hormones that are available early in the pregnancy is human chorionic gonadotrophin. That's what stimulates the estrogen and progesterone release. Later in the pregnancy, it's human placental lactogen, or here's the other name for the same hormone, and that allows for the glucose and amino acids to become available for the baby to grow. So this is an early, this is a later hormone. We've already talked about progesterone and how that allows for the endometrium to grow so that the baby, when it's first fertilized, has a place to settle in and gain nutrients from the tissues of the endometrium. And also it allows these fat deposition, as does estrogen, as does leptin. All of these hormones allow for the lipid formation, weight gain, fat storage that we saw that is so high in the first half of the pregnancy. The other important factor is this intrauterine growth factor. So without this, we don't have, if you didn't have intrauterine growth factor, just poor nutrition, poor protein intake, poor fat intake, that would inhibit the tissue breakdown and nutrient uptake without this growth factor. So again, this is very important. So it allows you to the baby to get to its genetic potential of having the right amount of muscle mass, the right length, the bone structure to have a full length baby. We'll talk in a few minutes about what asymmetric means. It just, well, I can mention now, it would mean a baby that's born that would be normal length, that actually got, pretty good length, but it basically wasted, would have very little muscle and very maybe, yeah, it looks wasted because it doesn't have that muscle mass. So that's important for the growth factor to allow that to happen, and also just to get enough calories so that you can have this growth factor. So asymmetric just means a normal weight, a normal length baby, but underweight because the fat was not able to be deposited sufficiently in the last trimester. So what is important then is the mother needs to gain adequate weight so that the baby gets the adequate weight for birth. 3 to 5 pounds is really all that the mother would gain the first trimester because there's not much growth in the baby. But then you see there's gradual gains in weight throughout the whole pregnancy. A normal pregnancy weight, it would be here. Under normal would be lower. We can look at the birth weight of the baby. It's going to, as the mother gains less weight, the baby's birth weight drops. So there's a direct connection. If you want to know what the recommendations for weight gain, there's this, depending what your BMI is before you're pregnant, you can determine what a good ideal weight gain would be by this chart. And then this just looks at where the weight is going. So some of it is the fetus. The fetus obviously is increasing in weight. Placenta is another reason we gain weight. The uterus, the fluid, the mammary glands and tissues, the blood supply, all these things add up to the total weight gain of approximately 32 pounds. This is a quick picture that shows you what it looks like when a cross-section of the baby, where the organs are going. You can kind of see like the pancreas and the stomach are kind of squished in here. And then the amniotic fluid. And then there's a small intestine, number 10. So it's just interesting to see how the layout of your organs are when you're pregnant. One of the things that's a concern is can we lose the weight we gained during pregnancy? Usually after delivery, you lose about 14 pounds, which is the amniotic fluid, the baby, and maybe some of your other body fluids. But the research is showing that if a mother gains more than 44 pounds during a pregnancy, it's much more difficult for her to lose all the weight. And if you are nursing or lactating, you lose more weight than if you don't. And then they recommend trying to lose enough weight so you might be a pound or two heavier after 1 year, but usually within a year you pretty much can lose the total weight that you gained during the pregnancy. Now here's a discussion of how the baby grows. If you press on this video, it shows some movement of the baby inside the womb. They had some video of that. And then this just shows the difference in how quickly they gain weight. And if they continued gaining weight at the rate they do inside the mom, it would be 160 pounds at 1 year. So we know that slows way down once the baby's born. Here's some idea about critical periods of growth. So not always are you just growing larger, but there's some times when your cells are differentiating and other times they're just getting larger. So those two words, hyperplasia, hypertrophy. So those are when it's hyperplasia, when you're multiplying new cells, those are sort of the critical periods of growth development. And those are the times when toxic substances would be detrimental, in particular, like alcohol or medications or street drugs, and can cause deficiency or birth defects. So back to this slide, you can see here that even just the DNA content changes with a highly well-nourished child. This is after birth, but it just kind of shows that there's not just DNA itself, but just the amount of DNA could change based on nutrition, which is really important for the cell formation. So just the baby itself, the body weight is containing water, just all these different minerals and protein. Another thing you might notice is how do we classify newborn babies. We'll talk about this in the next chapter about infants, but you're trying to prevent a small for gestational age. That means a child that was less than the 10th percentile than all the other babies at his age. And we mentioned already the proportional. So you might have a small for gestational age baby that's just small all the way around, under short length, or you might have a disproportionate, meaning a regular length baby, but very emaciated. So there's different ways they categorize babies at birth. Of course, we're going for appropriate or average gestational age, and large for gestational age is something over, usually around 10 pounds or more. And so the goal is to try to reach the average, the appropriate age for weight for gestational age. Something to be the 10th and 90th percentile would be appropriate, because there's much fewer birth defects, much lower incidence of birth death and illness in those babies. So then here we look at the nutrition for preventing miscarriages and preterm delivery. How can we do it? Because miscarriages could be caused by thyroid hormone imbalances, alcohol. They found that if you don't take multivitamins, women that didn't take multivitamins, and women that were underweight are much more likely to have miscarriages and preterm deliveries. Also, if their triglycerides were too high or LDLs too high, that has been detrimental. And same thing, preterm deliveries, if they found that by taking folate and multivitamins and omega-3 and exercise, these would help prevent. Exercise does improve, by the way, a good healthy outcome for the baby because there's more oxygen flow. It's helpful to have a better birth weight baby. So we want to make sure that we are preventing disease risks, and they're finding that if a baby is born small for gestational age and is there's more likely they're predisposed to having cardiovascular disease and chronic diseases as adults. So these critical periods they're finding make a big difference in how our genes are formed. This idea of plasticity of genes, there is changes even though we don't have new gene, we have a set genome. There can be differences in how they're manifested, and that can be affected by diet and by environmental problems. So here you can also watch this video that shows how that can happen. So I think my time is almost up and I haven't finished everything. So I will probably do one more podcast to finish up some of the nutrient necessities during pregnancy. Okay, thank you.